Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I should mention that unfortunately I didn't have time to do a disclosure slide, but I should disclose that I don't have a PhD, unlike Anne just gave me, which is very nice of you. But I am a registered dietitian. I work for Health Canada. I've worked for Health Canada for 19 years. So I don't have a conflict of interest, but like Anne, I do have the bias of working for government. So I'll quickly go over some of the presentation today. I'm just going to mention that I want to talk a little bit about food composition because there's different sorts of food composition and they all have their importance. And then I'm going to talk more specifically about food label use in Canada because that's something that is probably quite of interest here and the future opportunities as well for branded food in Canada. So if you look at the background of food composition in Canada, it dates back from quite a number of years. We could trace back some food composition table as far back as the 1940s. And quite interestingly, it was called Nutrient Values from Common Food, which is still the name today of our condensed version for the Canadian nutrient file. So that was quite interesting. I've never seen it, by the way. It's at National Library and Archives Canada. So. But traditionally, even from early on, it was used to develop our standards, our policies, and our regulations in Canada. And today we have a lot more variety of food composition data, but they all still have some interesting use. Just to go to the more traditional type of food composition table, so the Canadian nutrient file, which is our standard food composition database for Canada. I think what is important to mention there is that the database is made of a lot of generic food. And we've actually moved to that quite a number of years ago. We encountered some problem with our nutrition surveys when we moved to having Statistic Canada do the surveys. Branded food plus having consumption information, according to our regulation, look almost like market share. And they couldn't disclose this. So we wanted to resolve that problem in 2015. So our database over the years, we've moved towards more generic food, not as much brand-specific food. The other thing that's important about National Standard Food Composition Table is that you have a more limited set of number of food because they're generic. So ours is about 5,600 food, but you have up to 152 nutrients. So which is a little bit different than the label. The label, you have your 13 core and you may have a few additional one. But especially if you're trying to answer a research question or you're trying to develop public health policy, you want to look at a broader spectrum of nutrients because you want to see if there's nutrients that your population is not getting enough of or they're getting too much of. And that's often how you select the nutrients that are going to show up on your label because you're trying to address a public health concern there. As was mentioned, food analysis is very expensive. So we do have a sampling analysis program that is run by Health Canada. We do get a lot of our information actually from the US, from the standard release that was mentioned in the previous talk. For example, if the US has done analysis on oranges, I'm not going to do any analysis on oranges. Last time I checked, they weren't growing in Canada. I should say yet, but basically, so we'll focus our analysis on very Canadian food. So as Anne mentioned years ago, we analyzed we did a partnership on eggs, but we're going to look also at categories where we know industry is reformulating. So when industry was reformulating for trans fat, like taking out the partially hydrogenated oil, we did a large analysis of things like granola bars and cookies and crackers because we knew these products were changing. And again, we're using more a generic approach to these. So we develop sampling plan that try to represent about 85% of the market. But we're not going to call something like a chocolate chip cookie from this brand. It's a generic chocolate chip cookie from Canada. So when Anne was showing that slide, which was very interesting to see the audience reaction to it, is that you have the Canadian food, you have the US food, you have the Canadian nutrient file. But there's a reason why the Canadian nutrient file does not match the product-specific food, because it's a generic representation of what you have in the marketplace in Canada. And that's what we use for surveys. Especially when you're using for surveys, people will tell you, oh, I had bread. What brand was it? well, often they won't even know what it is. If it's not the shopper, good luck. If it is the shopper, they may know, or they may not. They may have grabbed the one that was on sale that week. So this is why those generic foods are very important, especially when you do surveillance activities. Now, that being said, there's other data sources that exist that are a little less used in terms of nutrients. The Total Diet Study is a good example of that. It's really a tool that is used to measure exposure to chemicals, and that's present in our food supply. Now, this started in 1969, and there's been kind of 6 different periods of time that have been looked at. There is about a collection that takes place almost every year. It's about 210 food products that are looked at. And they're looked at for a number of range of chemicals, and what you'll see in there, there's the trace elements right there. And that's where you'll see some of the nutrients show. Like, for example, traditionally we've looked at iron, we've looked also at sodium, potassium, iodine. So these were some of the nutrients I would look at. But we're looking more at trends, and often you'll see them in more raw single ingredients. They may monitor some of the branded food, but it's more single raw ingredients that we'll look at. And of course, the label information, that is another type of data sets that we use. What you might be interested in seeing is that on this slide is we've recently changed our regulations when it comes to the nutrition information, the nutrition facts table. Some of the changes that you're going to see now is that potassium has been added to the core list of nutrients, and vitamin A and vitamin C is no longer on the core list. The reason for it is that the majority of the population is getting sufficient amount. There's still some subpopulation, but we're looking kind of a more population approach in this case. But for the next 5 years, you'll probably see kind of a mix of the two. You'll start seeing some of the new labels because industry has a transition period. So you'll see old ones, you'll see new ones. And I've already started seeing some of the new ones on the market, so they're already starting to appear. Where I want to focus a lot of my presentation is how we use the label information. Traditionally, there's a few initiatives that you'll probably remember on this slide, like the Trans Fat Task Force and our sodium reduction strategy in Canada. We've used a lot of the label information. And one of the reasons for it is that specific foods often have a different nutrient profile, different ingredients are used. So within a category, you'll see, like years ago, you could see, for example, like cookies that would have trans fat and other cookies that didn't have trans fat. You can see within the same category, you can see a product that is very high in sodium, one is lower. So this is why a lot of the label information was used for these initiatives. And also, it's going to play a central role in the evaluation of a healthy eating strategy. So for those who haven't heard about the healthy eating strategy, it was launched in October 2016. It includes a number of initiatives. We're going to provide you with more information tomorrow, so that's a little bit of a teaser, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but for sure the label information will be used to assess how effective our policy is, because one of the objectives is to look at, basically the reformulation of the food in the food supply, so looking more at the food environment. So taking you back in time a little bit to the Trans Fat Task Force. Trans fat has been an issue in Canada for a number of years. In the 90s, we had one of our researchers who did some analysis of breast milk content, and he found that, and that's a good surrogate for intake of trans fat. And he found that Canadians were amongst the top consumer of trans fat in the world. That is not a statistic that you're you should be very proud of. Your goal should be to have trans fat intake as low as possible. WHO recommendation is your trans fat intake should be below 1%. So over the years, there's been a number of work, especially with the introduction of a nutrition facts table, mandatory nutrition labeling in the early 2000s, where trans fat was on the core nutrient list. We started seeing some changes, but still, there was still trans fat in our food supply. So in 2005, the Trans Fat Task Force was created. And this is where we saw an importance of looking at label information, because there was a great variation of whether partially hydrogenated oils were used or not. And in June 2005, Health Canada worked with the Food and Consumer Products Canada. We did a targeted scan of processed food in Canada. And really the idea was to look at the use of partially hydrogenated oils in Canada. When the Trans Fat Task Force report came out, one of the tools to monitor if industry was starting to implement it was volunteer measures, but we wanted to encourage industry to reformulate their products. So there was a monitoring program from 2007 to 2009 where we actually did some analysis, but we also did label review. And we did find there was quite an interesting progress where a lot of partially hydrogenated oils in some product categories stopped being used. However, in 2011, we did a risk assessment of trans fat intake in Canada using, again, information, product-specific information. And we found that it had decreased quite substantially, but we were still above the WHO target of less than 1%. So in September 2017, Health Canada published a notice of modification to prohibit the use of partially hydrogenated oil, and that came into effect in September 17, 2018. So just to show you how label information helped us develop our policy and lead towards the elimination of partially hydrogenated oil, which is actually now something that is going on in a number of countries around the world and is of great interest also to the World Health Organization. The next example I want to provide you with was Sodium Reduction Initiative. So that is another initiative. The Sodium Working Group was established in 2007. And one thing we were trying to look at is estimate sodium intake of Canadians. Now, we did have the information on average intake of sodium of Canadian by age sex group through our CCA, our Canadian Community Health Survey in 2004. But a lot of people saying, well, companies reformulate all the time, so we're probably not getting as much sodium. So we did the same exercise using label data as well as market share information. And we did come to exactly 3,400 milligrams. So we came to pretty much the same average intake. Now, what was interesting is we did see some differences in food categories in terms of the contributors. So some contributors were like, for example, number 2 was now number 3, and so on. So we did see a little shift in terms of which were some of the top contributor. So this is where we found that it was quite interesting to use label data in these type of initiative as well. The other way we use label data here is because our goal was to reduce the sodium content of the food supply, we decided to establish some targets that industry could gradually move towards. And to do that, we use existing data that was was in the food supply, so the food label information. And we also look at market share. And we establish those targets. Now, one thing that's very interesting is to ensure that those targets were achievable, and also that foods would remain safe. We have to remember that salt is used as a preservative in many cases to prevent microbial growth. We looked at different food categories. So often when we set a target, it was set within a level that was already found in that category. So that ensured to us that it was actually achievable and it was a safe level. Now, in those targets, industry was encouraged to basically meet them by 2016, the end of 2016, and we did an assessment that we published in January 2018, and we then again used food label to do our assessment to see how the change in different food categories, sodium had gone down. And we collect over 10,500 products that were collected. Now, I know Pamela talked about 200,000 products, but you have to realize that the same product can have different SKUs depending on the format. So, for example, a box of cereal, you may have several SKUs for the same product. So that's why we collected it was about 85% of each category. And we found there was kind of a modest reduction. Most categories had done some change, but not reached the targeted level. About 14% of the categories had reached the the target levels, but they weren't the top contributors to sodium intake of Canadians. So, so that's another example of where we actually had used label data. Now, in terms of future opportunities, I'm going to go very quickly through this, but there is, as you can see, food label data is something that we definitely use to establish our policies because we want to make sure they're evidence-based, they're relevant, and they're up-to-date. And the up-to-date is where it gets interesting. When we collect labeled information, and we saw that during the Trans Fat Task Force, especially the monitoring program, we would look at labels or we would do analysis and so on, and then we would post some of the results that we came about. And then companies would contact us and say, oh, this is old data, well, like we reformulated last month. Well, and this is what happens if you collect the information, you try to analyze and publish your results as fast as possible. But as Anne mentioned, the market changes rapidly. So if you have a tool like the USDA branded database, you can get this information in real time, and you can get more up-to-date information. The other thing to consider as well that is very interesting is we're at the digital age, and I'm just going to give you kind of, this is kind of a, not reflective of everybody around the room, but my massage therapist is very proud of saying that he buys everything on Amazon. I'm not doing publicity for Amazon. I think when he can't find something on Amazon, he's upset. If he could do his entire grocery on Amazon, he would do it. So think about this. How do they get the nutrition information? The nutrition information is on the product right now. So people at the grocery store, if they want, they can make an informed choice. They can look at the information. When you're shopping online, you don't necessarily have that information when you make your product selection. So something like a branded database can also have a huge impact on the consumer and basically in selecting products. So this is why these type of initiatives are very interested, and this is something that definitely would be of great benefit to Canada. So, thank you, everyone, and that's it.